So, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture this morning will be the final piece of the theoretical puzzle on pricing. And this will allow us to proceed on this morning, next step in talking about economic calculation, and then we'll get to capital theory and business cycles and all the more advanced topics in Austrian economics. So yesterday we at least gave you some exposition of the theory of pricing of goods and services. And then Dr. Sandy Klein explained how economic theory gives the analysis of the price of money. And there, the concept of the purchasing power of money, like the price of anything else that we talked about yesterday, is what in finance we might call a spot price, or what Murray Rothbard liked to call a cash transaction price. It's just both parties are fulfilling their obligation under the contract immediately in the present, right? You go to the gas station, you pay for gas, and you get the gas, and you give the money. And so we were talking about prices only in that particular context. And what we want to do this morning is introduce into this discussion about pricing the element of time. So we can think of it this way, or we can label things this way. We could talk about the price of money in two different time frames. One, the purchasing power of money is timeless, right? It's just this mutually advantageous trade that's continuously taking place, as we buy things and the seller selling things and we're transacting. We have a purchasing power of money. The other is the intertemporal price of money. And this is, of course, the rate of interest. This is when people trade, one party trades money sooner, fulfills the contract sooner, the lender, and then the borrower pays back the money later, right? And the interest rate is the price when this intertemporal trade occurs using money. And hopefully you can see right away that this is necessary to complete the whole logical structure of economic calculation, because entrepreneurs are using economic calculation to make investments in long-term projects or longer-term projects where they're not going to receive the revenue until the future, or a stream of revenue over time out into the future, and yet they're fronting the money. And so they're going to take into account what the intertemporal price of money is. And so that's where we're headed with all of this. Now we'll proceed in three steps. First, we want to talk about just a few fundamental points to finish up our foundational groundwork that we started with yesterday. And then we'll talk about two ways that are logically necessary for people, for you and I, persons engaged in valuing our actions with respect to time. They're two independent, separate valuations that we do. And so we'll, again, rehearse this with respect to the personal economy. And then with all of this in mind, we can launch into the nuts and bolts of the theory of interest. All right, so yesterday, remember, we talked about how because we're beings that are finite, that is, we have ends that we wish to fulfill, but just wishing to fulfill them doesn't fulfill them. We have to actually act, identify means and acquire them and engage in action and, think about the way in which we're combining things and choosing one thing and setting aside another. So this whole notion of scarcity and everything then that follows logically from that. And what we want to integrate into that discussion this morning is the fact that we're temporal beings. So all of our action takes place in time. And it makes sense then, before you think this out even, it makes some sense that we would pay attention to the intertemporal dimension of our action. So as finite beings, we distinguish between ends and means, and we have the scarcity of means and all the logic that follows from that. And as Mises puts it, as temporal beings, we distinguish between sooner and later. And because we distinguish between sooner and later, well, then there's an intertemporal logic, right, in action. Well, our valuations, in other words, have to extend to the intertemporal structure of action. And so that's where we want to focus. Now, in particular, what this entails is that action always involves a sequence of steps, or in capital theory, we call this stages, right? A sequence of actions are taken in order to produce first the good, the consumer good, and then to take the consumer good and engage in acts of consumption with the consumer good. So at the moment we decide to engage in an action, we can only anticipate what the realization of the end will be, because we haven't taken the steps yet that are involved in the sequence that's necessary, or that we choose at least out of the possible technical possibilities that are available to us in our circumstances. We choose some particular sequence of steps to eventually get the satisfaction of consumption. Now, Dr. Peter Klein yesterday talked about the implications of this for entrepreneurship. So you're already familiar to some degree with the field that we're going to cover. Every time we make a decision to start an action, we can only anticipate or forecast or predict, however you want to say this, the actual attainment of the end that we're aiming at. We don't know this through our own experience at the moment we decide on a course of action. Now, we want to focus, though, today on a different element of this, and this is what Mises calls the duration of an action. So as he points out, every action is set in a time frame where there's a time before the action takes place, and then we start the action, and then we've designed it to occur for a certain duration, the time during the action, and then we complete the action, and there's time after the action. And the reason to point this out is not just to rehearse some technical fact of human action, but to notice that the duration of the action is a choice variable. When we think about how we're going to pursue some particular end and choose it over another, we're taking into account also this very element of time. It isn't just, I've got means and I'm going to apply them and get an end. It's that if I use means this way, the duration of my action is extended in time, and if I use means this way, I have a shorter duration. And we can also, of course, decide when to start an action and when to stop it. And so that's where the valuation element comes in, and interest as a consequence of that. So there are two parts to the duration of any action. The first Mises calls the period of production, the time from the start of the action to the beginning of the attainment of the end. And this can be subdivided into working time, or stages of production that we mentioned before, and maturing time. I mentioned yesterday in talking about my own personal economy, my wife and I have a shared personal economy. I hope you enjoy this blessing of this yourself someday. But in any case, so I cut firewood. I mentioned this example. So there's this working time. It takes me 6 hours or whatever to cut the tree and to split it up into firewood. But then once I split it up into firewood, it has to sit there for a year. There's maturing time. You can't burn it. It's wet and it ruins the stove. You have to let it dry out. And you have a meter that you use to test to see it's dry enough to use right? There's maturing time before it becomes, I already know this. I already know this when I'm engaged in the production process. I'm already anticipating this. So this is the idea. And then once the period of production is finished, well, then we can engage in the usefulness of the good that we produce for consumption. Got the firewood, put it into the wood stove, stay nice and toasty warm in the wintertime, as my wife and I, enjoy the evening. So this is the idea of the division here. Now, the duration of serviceableness, too, has a time element to it. So we can choose to produce things, produce consumer goods that are more or less durable. Sometimes a consumer good, of course, is perishable, right? Pick an apple off the apple tree in our backyard and eat it, and it's in one service it renders in consumption and it's over. But others have different durations of serviceableness. And this, too, is a choice variable. We can produce products that have longer durations. They're higher quality, or however we would think about this, or of shorter duration. Okay, so next step. This is what I mentioned. We're going to concentrate a little bit on the two valuations of action with respect to time. Now that we see the conceptual framework of proper framework for thinking about this. The first is what Joe Salerno likes to call time placement. So this is the first way that we value an action with respect to time. And on the timeline, what I'm illustrating here is we have a given action, and we could start it at, say, on the left-hand side where it says start. Maybe that's Monday morning, and we're doing this action over the morning of Monday. And the second, further to the right, the second start would be, instead of doing it Monday, we do it Tuesday. That's the idea, right? We could choose. For most actions, we're able to choose when to take the action, right? When to start, when to stop, what the duration is. This is time placement. And as Mises points out, Mises, recommend to you all to read very carefully, maybe even over and over again, Human Action. It's quite a remarkable book. And felicitous phrases that he uses. And one of the great ones in the section on time is that time is an irreversible flux. And what he means by that is time is not just like an hour that's homogeneous with every other hour, or a day that's homogeneous with every other day. Quite the contrary. Every hour that passes through the day and every day that passes through the week and so on and so forth presents a different, at least in principle, different circumstances for acting. And because it does, it means that the value of taking a particular action can be influenced by the moment we start and the moment we stop, because the marginal utility of the consumptive gain that we're going to get from that action will depend upon the external circumstances, well, and our own judgments and so on in the future that are going to be different than they are at the present moment, from one moment to the next. So this is the idea. We're taking that into account, right? We're thinking about the scheduling of our actions through time. And by the way, even if we don't think about this carefully, it will affect the result of our action. Right? This is the point. There's a logic here. There's inescapable consequences that come from these points. Now, we can economize our action then with respect to time by selecting the time placement of the action that gives us the greatest value of the action. Now, of course, we're going to do this in combination with the other elements of the action, right? So it's not that we're saying that we always schedule things out in such a way that we think we're going to get the greatest value in that sense, but the cost of getting the means will be greater next week, or the value of attaining the end will be lower next week, and so we just ignore that. No. We put all these things together. That's the point. We assess the time placement with respect to these other elements that we've already considered and talked about yesterday. Now, if this is true, then it follows that the value of a good that we use, since it's imputed, the value of the good is imputed by us from the value of the end that we're attaining. If we value an end more highly because we placed it on Friday instead of on Tuesday, then the value of the goods that we're going to use to attain that end would also have greater value to us on Friday than they would on Tuesday. So we'll have a difference in the valuation that we place, the marginal utility of the good, across these different moments in time, depending upon how we're assessing the circumstances within which we're acting. And because of this, of course, the good itself or any particular good in principle itself could have a different, a higher value at one moment and a lower value at another moment. And in the market, this is what leads to forward prices. This, by the way, is completely distinct and independent from the interest rate. A forward price is just when two parties today agree that at some date in the future, they'll make a spot exchange, trading a certain amount of a good of a certain type for a certain amount of money. They don't do anything in the present except agree to make a trade in the future, and that future trade will be a spot trade. There's no intertemporal dimension to this. And so there's no interest rate involved in this, right? And we already know what the implication of all this is. We get efficient temporal allocation of the good. So if forward prices for oil 6 months forward, let's say from today, are $100 a barrel, and the spot price today is $67 a barrel, well, then traders will take that into account in their economic calculation, the entrepreneurs involved in this industry, right? And they'll hold the supply off the market today. They'll just let it sit in storage, and then they'll supply it at the date in the future, right? Or they'll engage in forward transactions to sell it at the higher price in the future. And this arbitrage will bring the prices together. It'll stop, in other words, when we have a completely efficient allocation where we're not using a good that has lower valued uses among people today in lieu of using it at a later date where people will value it more highly. This is how the market creates efficiency in the allocation of goods, not just across people or across places, but also across time. So this is a very important function of markets in our lives. But it has nothing to do with the interest rate per se. I mean, you've already learned, of course, that you talked about the social division of labor. You've already learned that everything is interconnected, right? In an economy, everything is put together in relationship to everything else by human choice. And so we have to pay attention to those interconnections. But fundamentally, these are entirely different things. So let's go on to time preference. So again, the two ways in which we value action with respect to time are time placement and time preference. And time preference generates the interest rate. Time placement, again, generates this we might call it the temporal allocation of the good. The allocation of the good from one moment to another moment in time, just like we would say the allocation of good from a person who values it less to a person who values it more, or a person in New York City who values it less to a person in London who values it more, and this kind of thing. Okay, so when we talk about time preference, the concept is looking just at each action. It's not looking at an action at different time frames. It's looking at an action that's already placed in the suitable time schedule. We're not looking at that element now. We're saying, suppose the start and the stop that I've got in this diagram has already been placed by the person where they want it in the flux of time. So that's not an issue. And we're going to look, time preference has to do with the interior intertemporal structure of the action. Okay, so we've already placed the action in the most advantageous start and stop duration. And we see, again, this, I've just divided out the two parts of the action, the period of production, the duration of serviceableness. And time preference says the following. It says that a person always prefers, given what we've said, always prefers to begin the satisfaction of the end closer to the start of the action. So if a person wants the duration of serviceableness to start at the middle vertical bar, whatever that day is or time, then a time preference says the person would always prefer the start of the period of production to move to the right and get closer and closer to the middle vertical line. You always want to shrink the period of production if you can get the same result, right? This is a ceteris paribus claim. And if we want to start the action at the left-hand side, if we want to start producing at the left-hand side, and we're not concerned about the duration of serviceableness, starting at the vertical line, then time preference says we want to move that vertical line closer to the start of the action. In other words, we always want to shrink the period of production. Ceteris paribus. If we can use the same inputs with the same resource costs and get the same result, we always prefer to shrink the period of production. Why is this? Well, as Mises puts it, there's disutility in waiting. Waiting provides us no utility whatsoever, quite to the contrary. There's disutility in waiting. It's a waste. To go back to my tree cutting example, if it were possible for me to engage in the tree cutting with everything else involved, the labor effort and the chainsaw and all the things that are involved in doing it, instead of taking 6 hours, if it just took 3 hours, that would be preferable, because then I would be freed up 3 hours to do other things that are valuable. But waiting it just has disutility, as Mises says. In fact, if I could just snap my fingers and have it all done, even if I had to expend all of the resources in order to do it, that would be preferred, right? This is the idea of time preference, the fundamental notion of it. Now, this is a fairly technical and rather cumbersome way to talk about time preference. And so when you see time preference discussed in the literature, it's often done in a sort of summary way. With all these circumstances that I've talked about and ceteris paribus conditions, it's just assume that you already understand that's all that's in play, and the time placement and all of that, right? So here we give a kind of working definition of time preference. And you'll see this in Mises and Rothbard and Federer and the other authors that focus on this concept. A satisfaction sooner is preferred to the same satisfaction later. That's sort of a working definition of time preference. But remember, that's only in the technical circumstances that we talked about. Is that true? And the other thing to mention about this, notice, is that this is purely, just like preference itself, this is just a purely logical notion, right? We're not talking about physiological aspects of acting or psychological time preference is not that we're impatient or something. That's a psychological notion. Time preference is a logical principle of any and all action, regardless of whether a person's impatient or patient, or whether their physiological needs are met or not met or whatever. Those sorts of things can influence the intensity of a person's time preference, right? All the circumstances of acting can affect the intensity of our preferences for things. But when we talk about time preference, we're talking about it in the abstract conceptual sense, in the same way that we talked about preference yesterday. Preference is just a concept; it's a category of acting, right? And the same with time preference. It's a category. It's a necessary category of acting. So it's important to keep that in mind, especially when we think about the implications of time preference. And this is something that we'll talk about more, the faculty will talk about more this morning, is that time preferences then, depending on the intensity of people's time preferences in society, that will dictate the intertemporal production structure. And since the intertemporal production structure, we mine iron out of the ground, we produce steel, we refine the steel, we form body parts for an automobile, we assemble the car, we ship the car to the dealer puts it out on the lot, the customer comes and buys the car. That's the duration of that's the period of production, right, part. And then the car is used by the customer over and over, that's the duration of serviceableness. Right? That structure of production, that the duration of it, the steps that are taken and so on, are all structured by or conform to the intensity of people's time preferences. As we say in economics, if people have lower time preferences, if they're more willing to incur the disutility of waiting, and they'll extend the processes of production out in time. And if they have higher time preferences and are less willing to do this, they'll choose shorter production processes. And so you could see the implications of this right away. Because people have time preference, they will always, in society, we're saying, in the market, the entrepreneurs will always choose the shortest, most productive production processes that are technically feasible. And then they'll extend those to the point where the costs of extending them further would rise sufficiently to make them not advantageous. And so when we think about what would happen if we have this structure of production in society, what would happen if people's time preferences went down or up? We could do this kind of dynamic analysis, right? Then they would, if people's time preferences go down, they would extend this length of the production processes, as Boom-Bawerk put it, the roundaboutness of production, right? The stages of production through time, and be able to take advantage of longer, more productive production processes. And in the history of the human race, that's why we end up where we are, and not where people were in 5,000 BC, because we've had low enough time preferences to engage in the saving and investing that's necessary to extend physical production processes, building up of capital structures and capacities and so on over time to augment the productivity of labor and land and enjoy the 21st century standards of living. Okay, the other thing, the one, so this is all again background that you'll see useful hopefully in the rest of the morning. And the other thing that we'll mention, the last thing is then the pure rate of interest. So the pure rate of interest, we're going to use this word pure to identify the time preference premium of present money over future money. So fundamentally, the interest rate arises in the market where lenders and borrowers engaged in intertemporal exchange of money do so by voluntarily agreeing to a particular premium that's paid by the borrower to compensate the lender for the disutility of waiting, to compensate the lender for foregoing using the funds that are lent to buy consumer goods and enjoy, sooner consumptive ends, to delay that into the future and then be compensated at the future moment with a greater payment that could be used to satisfy again other, more valuable ends that the lender is anticipating. So this is the idea, right? And what we're going to show as we move along through this is that we're defining now the pure rate of interest as the time preference premium of present money over future money. You'll see, if you read the broader literature, you'll see that, especially in the neoclassical literature, the interest rate is, just like all prices, are in kind. They're in goods. And so you get barter exchange ratios in Walrasian general equilibrium models, and you get interest rates in some numeraire good, right? Apples or bags of flour or whatever. But actually, all economic calculation depends upon having money. And this, again, is what you're going to talk about in the next hour. You can't have economic calculation unless you have a common unit in which everything is being priced. And this also then includes intertemporal exchange. And so we want to show why that's so with respect to the interest rate. And we'll do that as we go through the rest of the material. All right, so here's the logic. Remember, we did this yesterday with prices. We put out that the schematic, which showed that prices of consumer goods are just based upon our preferences, given our circumstance. Of course, we're always in particular objective circumstances that we're valuing and making our preferences, so that it's not that preferences are independent of that, of our circumstances. It's that our demands and supplies are determined by human judgment in those circumstances, and that our human judgments can't be, are not deterministically linked to those circumstances. that there's some degree of volition that we have with respect to judging our circumstances. And so we're going to argue the same thing. Like the logic is exactly the same. We've got time preferences, and time preferences will when we interact with each other, we'll find that some people's time preferences are higher, and therefore the interest payments that they're willing to make to buy or demand present money from a lender will be high enough to give incentive to the lender to agree to the payment, the price, the interest payment, for foregoing the funds that are lent to the borrower. And then just like before, right, if we have these paired exchanges, we have plain states of rest. Every time a borrower and a lender come together and they make a contract, we're in a plain state of rest. The market's clearing, in other words. And so it's the same argument that the logic of it is the same that we presented on Monday when we talked about prices. Now, I want to emphasize this, and again, we'll fill in the argument here in just a minute. The pure rate of interest then is always intertemporal trade of money and not goods. And again, the emphasis here is that the reason for this is that money gives us the unit of economic calculation. And if we didn't use money in lending and borrowing, then entrepreneurs would not be able to integrate on a common unit the monetary results of their engaging in longer periods of production, right? Where they're fronting money, they're buying a factory and they're paying up front to buy the factory, and the factory is going to generate a stream of revenue for them for 30 years into the future. Or they're buying labor and they're paying up front to, right, every month they make a paycheck issued to the worker, and the worker's working on a project, but the output isn't going to be sold for 6 months. They're fronting the money, right? They're lending. And so this is the idea. They're not doing this in apples or in flour, bags of flour or whatever. They're doing this in money precisely because they want to be able to integrate that monetary result into all the other monetary results of their costs and revenues and so on. And as I mentioned already, neoclassical models are almost always in barter exchange ratios, and then they just choose one of the goods as a numeraire, right? So everything's in barter exchange ratio. Let's just use apples, and it'll be the numeraire. And you can see that this is unacceptable. This is modeling gone bad. This is this is a deviation from the realism of the causal realist method that's more robust, precisely because it shows us how economic calculation, how the entrepreneurs integrate everything under economic calculation, whereas choosing a numeraire doesn't do this, right? Or saying, well, we have barter exchange ratios, and then there's money's just like a veil that kind of overcovers this, right? So that we as analysts, we can kind of then talk about money prices and so on. It's just an analytical device. No, that's not the way that the Austrian theory thinks about this. All right, so let's do a little bit of the nuts and bolts. Suppose we have person A on the left, whose preference rank I've reproduced. And you notice that person A has a certain rank order of the value of $1,000 in this person's hand today. And this person would value more highly $1,100. We're assuming the purchasing power of the money will be the same in a year. We'll get to that point at the end, or we'll relax that assumption at the end. The person would accept $1,100 in a year and sacrifice the $1,000 today. They'd prefer the higher rank to the lower rank, but they wouldn't accept $1,090 in a year. So if a borrower came to them and said, "I'll give you $1,090 in a year if you lend me $1,000," they wouldn't do it. That's what that preference rank says, right? By the way, again, the preference rank is just an analytical device. Remember, what we're using it to explain is that you have actual people out in the world and they're doing this, right? They're negotiating and they say, but they can't reach an agreement, and so they part ways. Or they reach an agreement and they make a trade. That's all we're using the preference rank to illustrate. It has to look like this logically. And you can see person B then has, as we say in economics, higher time preference, more intense time preference, more urgent desire for sooner satisfaction than person B has relative to person A. Because in order to bid away $1,000 from person B today, you'd have to pay a premium of $300. Whereas you could get $1,000 from person A just by paying a premium of $100, right? An interest payment of $100. And if you went to person B and even offered $1,290, if person B would lend $1,000 today, person B wouldn't do it. So person B and person A can make a mutually advantageous trade, right? At some interest rate between 10% and 29% inclusive. And when they make this exchange, the market clears. They're in a plain state of rest, given my preference rankings and so on. But they don't want to continue on and trade more. They just trade this one instance, this one unit of money, and then they go home. So that's what happens in general, right? We depict this again with a market graph, but the market graph glosses over this fact. What's actually happening is you just have the two parties are coming together and they're making a trade. My son and his wife go down to the bank and they take out a mortgage. And when they consummate the contract, then they're in a plain state of rest. They don't take out a second mortgage. They just go home or back to their apartment and wait for the time when they can buy the house. So this is our depict, right? The interest rate will be at the point that clears the market. It clears the market because it's mutually advantageous between the traders, right? And at different potential interest rates, we wouldn't see some of the mutually advantageous trade take place. And therefore, those interest rates don't exist. One's higher above R0 or one's lower below R0. Now, notice one other parallel between our argument here and the argument we made on Monday about prices, preferences and prices, is that time preferences then determine both the pure rate of interest and the amount of lending and borrowing in society, the amount of PM or present money that's lent and borrowed. It determines both. Or you could say this in the more macroeconomic way, time preferences determine both the interest rate and the amount of saving and investing. It's important to keep all the logic of all this straight. It's easy to get twisted around in thinking this out. And remember again, we've already stipulated that these time preferences exist among people within their given circumstances. So we're already integrating into this analysis the objective circumstances of the world. We're not saying that that's irrelevant, but simply how people act in response to the objective circumstances is a matter of human judgment. It's a matter of preference establishment. Okay, so now we get to this point that I've been mentioning as we go along. How is it that the interest rate in money integrates economic calculation? And well, it does this in the calculation itself of how interest rates work with respect to the relationship between present money, that is money in your hand now, and money at a future point in time that's in your hand. And we're all familiar with this, with compounding, right? You go down to the bank, you take out a CD, you lend them $1,000, the interest rate's 10%. A year later, they pay you $1,100. The interest rate then means that you can either have $1,000 in your hand or you can have $1,100 in a year. They're equivalent. I can have either one. If the interest rate were 5%, then it would be $1,000 in your hand and $1,050 in a year. They're equivalent. The interest rate makes them equivalent, right? Objectively equivalent. So if I'm an entrepreneur engaged in buying the services of a worker for a day or something, and I have to pay $1,000, or I'm determining what's my maximum buying price for the services. If I think that I'm going to get $1,100 in revenue from the services a year from now, when the product's finished, then I'll pay $1,000 for it today. I know that I'll pay $1,000 for it today because that amount of money is equivalent. This is the present value calculation. And those of you studying business, are already quite familiar with this calculation. But the reason why the calculation is meaningful, as opposed to just a formula, is because this is what allows the integration of intertemporal economizing to be done within the realm of economic calculation, monetary calculation. All right, so we could put it this way in summary, this point, that the pure rate of interest then equates the future value of money with the present value of money. And we mean objectively speaking, right? And this is across all persons, goods, places, times, and gives us this complete integration. Now, the last topic we want to take up quickly, at least introduce you to this, is what Murray Rothbard likes to call the time market. So he defines it this way. He says the time market is all intertemporal exchange of money. So any time a person engages in an intertemporal exchange of giving up present money in order to get money in the future, that would be part of the time market, and therefore it would command a rate of interest. Right? That kind of investment would earn interest as a rate of return. And then Rothbard subdivides the time market then into credit markets, which we've talked about already, right? We can go down to the bank, take out, my son and his wife went down 3 or 4 years ago and took out a mortgage and bought a house in Grove City. So they're credit markets that provide consumer loans. And you can see, again, the advantage to them. They could have waited longer periods of time, saved up over time. They could have extended the period of production to buy the house through their own personal saving and come up with the entire fund. Or they can just find somebody who will lend them the money. And if they can find somebody to lend them the money, then they shrink that period of production. And if they're willing to pay the interest premium to accommodate that shrinking, they don't want to wait, because guess what? They're going to have kids, and they don't want to raise kids in a crummy 2-bedroom apartment. They tried that for a year. It didn't work out very well. So they've bought a house, and now they got 2 kids. So I'm not sure what that means for the future. But I say the more the merrier as a grandparent. So, and then we can have producer loans, right? We could have entrepreneurs that go into the credit markets and borrow. And we can have capitalists then, as we'd use that term. Perhaps, again, Dr. Peter Klein was using that term and talking about entrepreneurship. We have capitalists who would come into partnership with the entrepreneurs and lend them funds. And then those producer loans are used by the entrepreneurs to invest in the capital structure. And so that's the second subcomponent of the time market. It's the capital structure itself, all production, in other words, where the entrepreneur is fronting money to the owners of the factors of production, or buying assets that have, where they front the money to buy the asset and then they earn revenues in the future. That too will command a rate of interest. And so this is where we get the manifestation in the market economy of the importance of the rate of interest, how the rate of interest guides the intertemporal structure of the whole capital production process in the market. And you can see then, and you'll learn again more about this this morning, you can see how disruptive it is for the chairman of the Fed, chairman of the board of governors of the Federal Reserve System, to cave into Trump for cheap credit. What if the central bank just produces credit ad infinitum through monetary inflation and pushes down interest rates? You can see how this would now affect the entire structure of capital investment, moving toward longer, extended capital structures, which, if we're not saving and investing sufficiently according to our time preference, will not be sustainable in the market. And so this is where this is the implication that you'll see again later this morning. All right, so we've come to the close. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.